Good evening, everyone. Hell's Unicorn here again, and I have a few things that I want to talk about tonight. The first thing that I wanted to mention is that tomorrow being Election Day, I am actually going to be working at the polls in my district here in eastern rural Pennsylvania. And what that will basically entail is I will be getting up at 5:30 in the morning to get to the polling station by 6:30, and I will then proceed to spend the next 12 hours basically taking signatures, making sure that everybody is who they say they are. Unlike in California here, you actually have to show ID in order to vote, so my job will be fairly easy, and I will probably not have to contend with any illegal immigrants trying to skew the election, at least in my area. I will probably do another video tomorrow night after the election is over, just to give my observations on how things went locally, and also to talk a little bit about the results of the election, which I am predicting will be a big sweep for Republicans and a return to the glory days of gridlock. All of you may remember, if you were old enough to remember the 1990s, that the gridlock that came in with a Democrat president in Bill Clinton and a Republican Congress back in 1995 was the beginning of a very prosperous era, and maybe with some good fortune that will be the case again. We can only hope. But at best, it may entail nothing more than simply stopping the current trends, which I would say definitely needs to happen. So on to the topic of this video. I've had a couple of Johnny-come-latelys show up on a couple of my videos spouting that Woodrow Wilson was not the worst president ever, and they instead point to George W. Bush. Now, I don't like George W. Bush at all. I thought he was lousy. I'm not a big fan of the foreign policy that he ended up subjecting us to, nor was I a big fan of a lot of his entitlement expansions, overspending, and a couple of other policies that he had. He was terrible on civil liberties. And so I've decided to answer these Johnny-come-latelys, as it were, by going to a couple of websites and just showcasing some presidents in our history and how they fare on the topic of civil liberties. And according to some outspoken progressives who are very much interested in the topic of civil liberties, they have some very different opinions from your average Obama zombie who thinks that George W. Bush was the worst president ever, probably because they haven't had to experience any other bad presidents since before him. Although I will say that the past 4 presidents that we've had have not been that great, and I would say that the current one and the previous one, Bush and Obama, are both lousy. I would argue that the current one is a little bit more lousy than the previous one, because at least the previous one didn't just take us to the brink of bankruptcy. He pushed us along a lot, and the foreign policy expansion is probably going to help pave the way to that happening, but the internal entitlement spending over the past 2 years has been utterly ridiculous. All right, so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to read the top 8 worst presidents on civil liberties. And this was put together by a guy named Tom Head, I think his name is. I don't know if that's his real name or not, but he wrote this article for About.com, and it has to do specifically with the topic of civil liberties. And I'm going to be counting down from number 8 to number 1. There's a little foreword that I'm going to read also here. There's something about the office of the presidency that attracts narcissists and megalomaniacs. While some presidents shredded the Constitution during a wartime panic, I'm looking at you, Abraham Lincoln, these 8 leaders went above and beyond that to discernibly shift our country a little bit closer to the edge of fascism. Oh, sure, none of them were all bad, but on civil liberties issues, these 8 men are the worst of the worst. First, number 8. George W. Bush. Some political commentators claim that George W. Bush will go down in history as the worst president ever, but I don't believe that. It would be more accurate to describe him as the second worst president of the post-war era. Climbing to the nation's highest office after overseeing more lethal injections than any other Texas governor in history, before or since, Bush soon made a name for himself by using the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives to reward his political friends, using the Department of Justice to punish his political enemies, and using the fear of international terrorism to radically expand executive power. Number 7. Richard M. Nixon. Both LBJ and Nixon abused FBI surveillance programs to unconstitutionally monitor the activities of activist groups, but at least LBJ worked to advance civil rights reforms. The same can't be said for Nixon, who stonewalled further progress on civil rights, created the federal war on drugs apparatus, and expanded the power of the presidency so much that his administration is still the imperial presidency, by which all other unitary executive presidencies are judged. Number 6. John Adams. There are things to like about John Adams. Were it not for his support of the U.S. Supreme Court, there wouldn't really be one. But the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 made him the only president in U.S. history to support and sign legislation specifically written to criminalize his opponent's political campaign. Frustrated by supporters of Thomas Jefferson and the press, who criticized Adams, the thin-skinned president supported new federal sedition laws targeting anyone making unsubstantiated remarks about a government official. Adams had some of Jefferson's most prominent supporters arrested under the law, but it didn't do him much good. Jefferson won the presidency in 1800, and Adams's Federalist Party never won national office again. Number 5. James Buchanan. Some presidents are associated directly or indirectly with major Supreme Court rulings of their tenure. When we think of Miranda v. Arizona 1966, we might lump it together with Johnson's Great Society reforms. When we think of Korematsu versus United States 1944, we can't help but think of Roosevelt's mass internment of Japanese Americans. But when we think of Dred Scott versus Sanford 1857, we don't think of James Buchanan, and we should. Buchanan, who made pro-slavery policy a central tenet of his administration, boasted in advance of the ruling that the issue of slavery expansion was about to be resolved, speedily and finally, by his friend Chief Justice Roger Taney's decision, which defined African Americans as some subhuman non-citizens. Number 4. Millard Fillmore. When Millard Fillmore took office in 1850, slave owners had a problem. When slaves escaped to free states, law enforcement agencies in those states refused to return them to their owners. Fillmore, who claimed to detest slavery but invariably supported it, had the Fugitive Slave Act of 1853 passed to remedy this problem, not only requiring free states to return slaves to their owners, but also making it a federal crime not to assist in doing so. Under the Fugitive Slave Act, hosting a fugitive slave on one's property became dangerous. Fillmore's bigotry wasn't limited to African Americans. He was also noted for his prejudice against the growing number of Irish Catholic immigrants, some of whom were my ancestors, by the way, which made him extremely popular in nativist circles. Number 3. Andrew Jackson. In addition to being the biggest slave owner in the southwestern United States, Jackson was a believer in manifest destiny, what he and others considered the God-given right of whites to conquer North America from coast to coast. When Jackson discovered gold on Cherokee land in Georgia, he simply ignored existing treaties and had one of his own agents, John Ridge, negotiate the Treaty of New Echota on behalf of the Cherokees, forcing their displacement on what became known as the Trail of Tears. Jackson is also the only president in U.S. history to openly defy a Supreme Court ruling. In response to Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, Jackson was reported to have said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Number 2. Woodrow Wilson. Wilson, former president of Princeton University, was no thug, but his contempt for those first-generation immigrants he deemed Yaffaden Americans and threatened to have crushed out played into the nativist and anti-communist sentiments of his era, bringing the United States closer to fascism than it had ever come before or since. The lowlights of his administration included the Sedition Act of 1918, which criminalized all radical criticism of the government, the Palmer raids, in which he ordered the arrest and attempted illegal deportation of over 10,000 people, and numerous specific instances in which he ordered dissenters to be silenced. America under Woodrow Wilson was a nation under lockdown. And number 1, Andrew Johnson. And we begin with a quote of his. "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." That was Andrew Johnson in 1866. Johnson was the worst president in U.S. history. It's not because he created Jim Crow, although he did. It's not because he fought passage of the 14th Amendment, although he did. And it's not because he failed to create a way forward for Southerners of all races, condemning the South to over a century of poverty, though he did that too. No, it's because he did all of this because he could. He wasn't a wartime president. He faced no new terrorist threats. He just inherited the presidency and used it to push his own prejudices. History has never forgiven him for that, nor should it. Now, in addition to this particular site that I've been reading from, I've posted a couple of other links. One is a link to the Wikipedia page in which we have all the presidents ranked. And Woodrow Wilson tends to rank fairly high amongst various surveys involving more intellectual thinkers and various historians. However, when it comes to current modern-day polling of so-called liberals and conservatives, generally speaking, the presidents that are selected as best and worst aren't really all that different. This kind of feeds into the video that I made earlier in which I talked about the Demopublicans and the Republicrats, the two parties that think almost exactly the same. Now, when it comes to the polling of the standard populace, as it were, the people at large, we don't see a lot of variety either, and I would argue that this is because education of history in this country has become an utter joke. But nevertheless, I think it would be profitable to look over this, and also I have a specific website that is dedicated to Woodrow Wilson, and I'm just going to read off the bullet points of this because it gives some good information about Woodrow Wilson, and I advise everybody to read this entire article. Wilson was the first president to criticize the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. You've got it. He was the first person to do that. Before we had the Constitution as just a damn piece of paper, George W. Bush, we had a variety of other detestable quotes from this man almost 100 years earlier. Wilson sought war with Germany and purposefully drew the U.S. into World War I. Wilson created the first official propaganda department in the U.S. Wilson harshly suppressed dissent and resistance among citizens and the press. Wilson took over the U.S. economy completely. That would make him worse than Obama, as hard as that is to believe for most people living today. Wilson himself was a major cause of the outbreak of World War II. In sum, Wilson was the first fascist president of the U.S. and the first major fascist dictator of the 20th century. Yes, America beat Italy and Germany to that one. All right, so in conclusion, I would argue that Woodrow Wilson was the worst president ever. Some people think differently, but I would say he has to at least be in the bottom 5. He was a complete disaster, and I don't know how anybody can defend the stuff he did. It's amazing that people can. But oh well. Until next time, with prudence to myself and benevolence to all of you, good evening.